reduces some of the,
The Mercer Place subdivision road is approximately, if I remember correctly, around 15 meters in width. The one proposed for the Albury property is approximately 10 meters. That is a permissible standard based on a Bearland Strata subdivision. And again, one of the differences between fee simple subdivision and Bearland Strata is twofold, is that you can look at reduced standards for engineering, such as the road width. You can also do lot averaging in a Bearland Strata, where you're not permitted to do that in a fee simple subdivision.
Thank you. And a question to the engineer, please. So if this passes, we'll see 16 new lots added to the sewer system, because that's a variance being asked. Will there be any cost to the current sewer users, or will all the costs be borne by this new subdivision?
Through the chair to Councillor Brown, the developer would be responsible for all costs. None of the costs would be borne by the user group, so all costs by the developer would have to be paid for the sewer's attention.
Councillor Burton.
Thank you very much. Question to planning. Is the applicant committed to build around the trees that he's committed to preserve? Or once we approve 60, if we should approve 16 lots, can he clear within the footprint? What are we trying to preserve, the 16 lots or the trees?
Hopefully a bit of both. In terms of the trees that can or can't be removed, if it's within the building footprint, it can be removed.
But is it fair to say that the applicant has already indicated which trees have to be removed?
Yes, they have through their arborist report, but there is obviously areas where they would attempt to save them, but they may not know until they actually get out on site and start doing some of the work. But they have committed with their arborist to be on site and to assist in as much retention as possible.
Will we know that when it goes to public hearing, as far as the layout?
We've asked the applicant this evening, and if it proceeds subsequently to public hearing, to provide additional information on tree retention.
Thank you.
Seeing no more questions from council, I have one myself to planning. There's an indication in the report that the desire is to have pedestrian access through the Strata Road. Now, how would, since the Strata Road is essentially a private road, what mechanism would we use to ensure that that happened?
You'd have a public right-of-way registered over the basically private road to allow pedestrian access, and that is to provide pedestrian access from the south through to the neighboring neighborhood to the north.
Yeah, and has that been discussed with the applicant, and is the applicant favorable?
We received exactly 100% clarification. I'd asked the applicant to address that. I'd received nothing in the negative that I'm aware of, but again, I would refer to Mr. Tinney.
Okay, thanks very much. Seeing no more questions, I will invite the applicant to come forward and make a presentation at this time.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. My name is Roger Tinney. I'm the project planner. And with me this evening is the full contingent of the design team. In the front row is the Alberg family. And behind them is Patrick Lucy, the project biologist, Jeremy Jai, the project arborist, and next to him is Dan Boot, the project designer. So hopefully as we go through this slideshow, if there's any questions, whether you want historical perspective from the Albergs or current in terms of design and layout, I think we should be able to answer all of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tinney. Before you begin, you probably heard that the council would have an interest in hearing how you're going to address parking, and also the issue of is there a willingness to allow pedestrian access through the Strata Road?
Sure.
Thank you.
This is a very unique piece of property. It's highlighted on the slide, outlined in yellow. It's a 1.6 hectare property, 4 acres, on Mount Doug Cross Road, and it's got a double fronting lot. It fronts on Mount Doug, of course, and a small section fronts on Linfield Crescent at the back of the property. It's unusual in the sense that it's zoned RS18 single family, and it's also in the agricultural land reserve and within the urban containment boundary. So before I get into the particulars of the application tonight, I want to just give a couple minutes of historical background, particularly for the new council members that are here, and perhaps for members of the public that haven't been following the application quite so closely over the last roughly 4 or 5 years. And I won't spend a lot of time on it, but just a quick overview of the 2 previous applications, because this is actually the 3rd application now that's come forward to council. This layout you see on the screen now is from 2011, and that's a 16-lot layout. And a tremendous amount of time and effort went into that application. We decided amongst ourselves and the family that we wanted to try and put an application forward that was far beyond the norm for a subdivision application. And this one went to a great level of detail in terms of building location, building size, road layout, parking, public access, and a whole bunch of green initiatives, not only in the development itself, but also in preservation of the Gary Oaks that are on the property. And we even took it to quite a high level that you would typically see for a townhouse or a condominium development, where we actually did a 3D rendering to show what the finished product would look like. And for those of you who were around for the 2011 application, you'll remember that it was rejected. At the time, there was a lot of emphasis put on the fact that the property was in the agricultural land reserve and that it should remain there. And I'll get into it a little bit more in the application, but the Land Commission has identified this property to come out of the ALR for many, many years, roughly 30 to be specific. And also the Gordon Head Local Area Plan has identified this property to be removed from the ALR. And we've had support also from the Gordon Head Residents Association. So we were quite surprised at the time that this was put forward that it didn't go ahead. But there was reasons for that at the time, and we respected that. We then went back to the drawing board and did a lot of rethinking of the property. And again, for those of you who were on council at the time, you'll remember that this application came forward roughly 14 months later in 2012. And this is for a 14-lot subdivision with a community garden at the front of the properties on Mount Doug Crossroad. And we thought that it was a nice hybrid or a blend between some residential development on the property, which was always anticipated and expected, certainly by the neighbors and others, and also recognizing the fact that agriculture was a prime of interest to council, and that would sort of accommodate a bit of both and hopefully move the application forward. And that too generated an artist's rendering of what that might look like. And we were a little bit surprised during the presentation that a lot of people weren't as keen on the community garden at the front of the property as we thought they would be. Many people felt that community gardens in general were kind of unsightly, and they weren't particularly keen on living next to it. And as a result of that, and among other things, that application got rejected as well. And at that time, I know I'm very quickly jumping through these first couple of slides, but they represent tens of thousands of dollars and several years worth of work to get to that point. And to have them both rejected quite soundly was disappointing to say the least. So the Allbergs and ourselves had to go back and do some thinking about what to do with the property. And there was a number of options that we kicked around. I'm speaking primarily for the family. They decided possibly about doing nothing with the property at all, just sitting for a while. Another option they considered was, should they sell the property? Should they come back with a 3rd application? Or should they actually consider farming the property? And as I'm sure all of you know, and probably everybody in the council chamber, that option D was selected. And given the fact that the Allbergs have a history as a farming family and they're still active in the cattle farming business today, it's not overly surprising that they elected to pursue option D. And as you know, for quite a few months, there was, if not the better part of a year or more, there was cattle on the property, and that didn't go over well at all with the neighbors. Had been expressed to them for a number of reasons, most of which are obvious. There was the noise, the smell, the odors, and that sort of thing. And that was in 2013, and at the same time, around then, the environmental development permit area was introduced to Saanich, and not just to this property, but to the municipality as a whole. And this property was subject to that, and the area in pink outlined the environmental development permit area. And as you know, those environmental development permit areas were established by provincial air photo mapping, and it was always the intention, if your property was subject to that, that you would hire a biologist, in this case Patrick Lucy of Aquatex, and they would go out and field test and field check the site to see, in fact, if it is a sensitive ecosystem. And in this case, it wasn't, and I think you probably have in your agenda packages the report from Patrick Lucy. And the only area that was identified is highlighted in green, and there was an area of camas in the property. So, after considerable debate about that issue and the cattle themselves, the family and ourselves were getting increasing pressure from the neighborhood to please bring back a third application to council. And we discussed amongst ourselves what that application would look like and what was most appropriate for the property given what had happened in the past. And the application this evening that we are hoping you'll consider and hopefully move forward is this layout here. And this is again a 16-lot subdivision, which embedded in it is a great amount of detail covering everything from parking and green initiatives, public access, and other things. And it also highlights the areas that were identified in the environmental development permit review. And I should mention too that if there's anything that I am quickly glossing over that you want more detail on, please ask me, of course. But again, we've got the whole design team here, and if there's anything you want more detail on, they're certainly available. So this layout proposes 14 strata lots and 2 fee simple lots. And I won't get into all the minutiae of that at this hour in the evening. The 2 fee simple lots come in off of Linfield Crescent, and we had a little bit of talk earlier about the difference between strata lots and fee simple. And the other 14 are accessed off of Mount Doug Crossroad. There is a pedestrian link that connects Linfield Crescent through Mount Doug, which eventually will lead you down to the Galloping Goose Trail. And that's not only a pedestrian link, but it's also for emergency fire access if needed. There will be bollards on either side of that, so a fire truck could get through in the event that there was a blockage at the Mount Doug Crossroad. With all of the applications past and present, they involved a review by the agrologist, and this is just a site plan showing the test pits that were done by the agrologist, and it was done in 2010, which is quite some time ago. But I think included in your package is a more recent letter from the agrologist indicating that the site remains the same, that it was not suitable for soil-based agriculture, that soil conditions were quite poor, and the report, I think, is also included in your agenda package, and it's quite extensive. In addition to that, we've had an arborist report work with us all along the way, and as I mentioned, Jeremy Jai is here this evening. There's roughly 166 Gary oak trees on the property. There's roughly 153 now. Some of them are lost to natural causes, and others were lost to accommodate the cattle operation. So we're down to about 153 trees now. And although it's a little hard to see on this diagram, they're all identified as to which ones will be removed and which ones will remain. And I think, as Councillor Brown also mentioned, ones that may be possibly retained if they were in the building envelope. And with regard to, I think, Councillor Saunders' earlier comment about infrastructure, we have spent quite a bit of time on the subject of infrastructure, particularly because of the Gary oak trees that are on the property. This level of detail is typically not brought forward until after the application is approved, but as many of you will know, with underground services and root zones and the quantity of trees on the property, it was quite important to have this level of detail on the front burner of the application, and we've included that. It has stopped short of showing cable and internet services, but certainly the big ones, sewer, water, and storm, have all been identified on the property. And if you're interested, the property feeds by gravity down the length of the spine, across Mount Doug Crossroad and into Livingston, and there's capacity for that. This drawing is not really intended to be viewed in detail at this time in the application, but we had a number of questions both from the public and from staff if we could layer all of the information onto one drawing, and certainly in a larger format this drawing is useful. As you see it now, it's a little bit difficult to read, but it's a very interesting and a very important drawing to have in the package, because there are many layers that have been involved in this. The Gary oak trees first and foremost, and they're highlighted in the black dark outlines. And there's 7 Gary oak areas in total being identified to be protected by covenant. And then the buildings themselves, both the size and location of the houses are all identified on the property. The driveways, rain gardens, protected areas, public access, and so on. So this drawing is very critical, certainly for someone like the engineering staff and for planning as well. There's also a building scheme going to be registered in the property, and it's intended to control the built form, being the houses, and it's intended not to be overly regulatory. In many ways, trying to control the design of a development can be as problematic as having no design controls at all. So with the building designer, Dan Boot, we've put together a palette of colors and materials that will apply to all the houses. And this diagram goes along with written text for the design scheme as well. And that will be registered by covenant against all the properties. And whether the properties change title, it's attached to title, so it's transferable regardless of who owns the properties. And we wanted to regulate the development so that we had control to some degree over what was built on the property. There's nothing worse than when you go to a great deal of detail in terms of your subdivision layout, and the first couple of houses architecturally are a little bit off the mark what you had in mind, and sometimes can either spoil the whole development or set the tone off in the wrong direction for what was envisioned, certainly from the applicant's perspective and from the neighbors as well, because they've been heavily involved in this all along. And the final design layout shows a perspective very similar to what we proposed originally. It's increased in standard a little bit in terms of the built green. We were originally at built green silver for the houses. We're now at built green gold. And porous paving materials, house sizes are modest in terms of comparison to other properties. And the property in terms of the RS10 zoning, they're not maximizing the gross floor area that's being permitted in that zone. Again, regulated by covenant. So it's kind of an interesting and unique situation to be in for a development like this. This is a perspective coming from the back of the property of Linfield Crescent, and just a view of what it'll look like. But it's rather unusual to have a property where an owner is willing to embed so many levels of detail into it now, which to some degree will hamper marketing and hamper development. But the Albergs were adamant that they wanted to leave a legacy and do something special with the property, and not just a conventional subdivision. And that's why the first 2 rejections were sort of heartfelt, perhaps more than others. I know it happens in the industry, but those 2 stung. So we're now back with a 3rd application. We think we've worked all the bugs out of it this time, and we heard loud and clear from the neighborhood that they're not interested in having an agricultural use on this property, that they had always envisioned and they always wanted residential development. It's in keeping with the Gordon Head plan. We've got a development that is modest by comparison in terms of house size and scale, and I think with your blessing we'd like very much to move forward to a public hearing. So in the interest of time in the hour of the evening, I'll perhaps conclude my presentation there, and I'm certainly available for questions as well as the family and the whole design team.
Was your intention to have other members of the design team come forward, or are you completing the presentation?
I don't think so. That's completing the presentation. Certainly if you'd like to hear from, for example, the project biologist with regard to the EDPA area, or more details about building design, or the arborist, they can certainly come forward.
Okay, and I think we have some questions from Council. Councillor Sanders, then Councillor Murdoch.
Thank you, Councillor Doohan. Mr. Tinney, I was pleased to see that there's going to be a projection of the size, but I haven't been able to find it in the documentation, and I've assumed from the recommendation that it would be in the building scheme, but perhaps I'm missing it. I don't see anything in here that says the maximum size would be 200 and whatever it is. Square meters rather than 400 and whatever square meters. Can you just point me in that direction so I can be comfortable that that actually is covenanted?
Yeah, we discussed that extensively with planning, and that's going to be form part of the covenant.
Where is it? We have a recommendation here, and it says about the building scheme is going to pertain to the size, and I don't see it in the building scheme. So is it here and I'm just not seeing it?
No, it's just the final details of the building scheme haven't been completed yet, but that's an item that will be incorporated into it.
Okay, and then also on here, the design objective says 7 individual residential units. What does that mean? At the top of the building scheme.
7 individual residential units?
Proposed design objectives of 7 individual residential units. What does that mean?
As embarrassing as it sounds, I think that just may be a typo left over from a previous design scheme that was used.
Okay, well, I'm looking for that covenant so that I can guarantee the size is being...
Well, absolutely, and not only do we want the size of the houses regulated to that, they're actually designed to scale on the drawing to reflect that size.
Thank you. So that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Councillor Murdoch.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was interested in hearing about the condition of the trees.
Would you like to hear from the arborist himself?
If the arborist can speak to it.
Sure, absolutely.
So Jeremy Jai and our corporate offices are in Saanich on Wallace Drive. So the trees are an even-aged stand of Kerry oaks, and the biological and structural condition of the trees was mixed, I would say, when I originally looked at them several years ago. And in the intervening years, with the land use, a number of them have deteriorated. In fact, we've lost a number of trees. They have actually failed on the site. So from a tree preservation point of view, we've still got a lot of trees left. We've put, and a lot of those trees are in fair to good condition. And we've put a great deal of effort into preserving them as best we can, and we'll continue to do that going forward. But stepping back a little bit and just acknowledging that this is an even-aged stand. It's mature for its site conditions. I would, as an urban forester, I would be putting a lot of emphasis into replanting and trying to get the next cohort of trees established. I think the great thing that we've preserved here is growing space for urban forest sustainably for a very long term. And right now it's going to be this generation of trees, but we want to make sure that there is continuity and sustainability there.
Thank you. I guess my primary concern is about the integrity of the trees that have been identified for retention, and whether or not they'll endure just on their own, never mind any further activity on the site. And then furthermore, the introduction of construction and utilities, I'd be very concerned about further failure of those trees.
Well, if this moves forward, I mean, I'll be engaging with the resource again as it is today, so I'll be, assessing their condition one more time. I can't emphasize enough how diligent and how integrative the design process has been here in order to avoid the kinds of really damaging and disruptive conflicts between utilities and roads and buildings and trees. So these areas that we're showing as covenanted, protected woodlands, essentially mini woodlands within this thing, I think are going to give us a higher than normal ability to retain trees effectively. If we combine that with reforestation as well, I think we're going to have really good outcomes here.
Well, you're up there, Mr. Jai. Perhaps just one follow-up question. I noticed in the report, I think on page 12, the interest in replanting Gary Oaks. What size would you anticipate, and how in a strata development, what kind of measures will take place to ensure that those trees mature?
Both good questions. It's probably a level of detail we're not ready to tackle just yet, excepting to say that, well, first of all, that the supply of Gary Oak in nurseries is limited. So in terms of getting trees of you know, a full size, it's often challenging. We're also looking for trees of very local genetic provenance as well. So we do have a number of nurseries that we go to, but the trees will probably range in size, I would expect, from 1.5 to 3 meters in height. Can you repeat the second part of it? Oh, in terms of protecting them.
Survivability.
Survivability, yeah. I expect there will be, I think we're showing some fencing. I think for the establishment period, particularly for deer browsing, there's probably going to be the need for some additional protection. But we'll be doing things like making sure that they're well irrigated, that there's mulching in place, and all the regular best practices that ensure, you know, good long-term viability.
Thank you very much. You finished, Councillor Murdoch? Thank you. Councillor Wortland, and then Councillor Haynes.
Thank you very much. Going back to the Natural State Covenant, are they fenced?
Yes.
Can anyone go on that property once it's fenced?
The short answer is no. And you can see them in the rendering. There's split rail fences around each of the Gary Oak Covenant areas. And there'll be interpretive information plaques there as well, letting the residents know and any members of the public that are walking through there what exactly those areas are and why.
Who maintains it?
That's Strata. Yeah.
To what standard? Who determines how it's maintained?
Well, it's identified in the design building scheme for the property, and somebody like Jeremy Jai would provide an overview for the homeowners. Because the worst thing you can do for a Gary Oak area, as you know, is either to water it or to go in and start, you know, whippersnippering the area. So the idea is to leave them in a natural state.
Yeah, I'm sure we'd all like one of those in our backyard, so to speak. It becomes a very difficult thing to manage if...
Oh, it does. Yeah, it is tricky, but we've got a mechanism in place, and we'll certainly do the best we can.
So noxious weeds and things like that, they're all taken care of?
What's your response?
Just a simple yes or no. It's
Yeah, well, I figured since Jeremy's here, I might as well let him answer.
We call them natural state areas, but in fact, there aren't any more natural areas. If we don't manage them, they become invasive species refugia. So there will have to be some type of management regime. I expect, and you could probably get a commitment from the proponent on this, that we will provide the guidelines and best practices for that management by the strata.
okay, thank you.
And just to conclude, I suspect the Strata Council will have a landscape company that will maintain the strata, would be my guess, and they'll be certainly versed and experienced in what to do, if anything, with the Gary Oak protected areas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Haynes, then Councillor Sanders.
Yeah, just a brief one, if I may, and you may call up your arborist again. I see that on page 12, Gary Oak population over time, new Gary Oak plantings will meet or exceed 2-to-1 replacement ratio for the 34 viable oaks. So 34 times 2 is 68. These 68 trees can be accommodated as they grow to maturity within the space allocation, or do you anticipate that through time there will be natural die-off? Or how do you envisage 10, 20 years out from now?
That's an excellent question. I expect these will be, my own vision is that these will essentially become Gary Oak ecosystems, small groves, sort of forest stands of oak woodland. So the density, the stem density can be higher than you would see, for instance, on streets or where you have specimen trees. And there's going to be some natural attrition from shading and perhaps we might get the odd snow load or something. But typically, I expect as a whole, these stands will do very well. And those numbers don't concern me at all. They're healthy numbers.
Thank you. If I may, through the chair, to my colleague, Councillor Sanders, I think on page 101, the planner makes a note, fourth paragraph up from the bottom, that gross floor area for the development dwellings would be restricted by covenant to approximately 232 metres squared, which is less than the maximum 435 metres squared permitted for the RS10 zone. So I think our planner identified that, but I'm not sure if that addresses exactly what you want.
Thank you, Councillor Haynes. Are you complete?
Thank you.
Councillor Sanders.
Yes, back to your question, Mr. Tinney. You're talking about these natural state covenants, and they are surrounded by split rail fencing. They're owned by the strata. I'm looking at the map here, and does that mean some of these people don't have a yard at all?
Well, I should rephrase that.
I think so, because I mean, you know, it's.
Sure, you're right. I'll go back to the site plan, perhaps a little easier. Some of those Gary Oak covenant areas that are outlined in dark, you're correct, extend over onto private lots that will be owned by private individuals, but they won't have individual use of those areas. They're going to be buying that lot, and they're going to be paying taxes on the square footage of that lot in their house, but yeah, they're not going to have control over what goes on in that covenant area.
So if they're really keen about Gary Oak Meadows, they want to do something, they aren't going to be able to?